So to get us started, I just thought maybe would you be up to say just a few words or a couple of things about your academic background?
So I'm a philosopher in the sense that I did my MA and BA in philosophy in Ghent University in Belgium. I studied there and I was a teacher in ethics for a while. I had focused strongly on research of Friedrich Nietzsche and French critical theory, but also Buddhism. Those were basically my three directions in my undergrad studies. And then I pursued a Ph.D. in religious studies as a philosopher, as a hermeneutician, hermeneutics of religion and religious diversity, and with a focus also on contemporary religion, new spirituality, and what we call multiple religious belonging or hybrid religiosities. So a bit interdisciplinary, but those are my main strands of research, or my academic signature, as you want to call it.
Amazing. And how would you, or how exactly did you go from, let's say, religious studies to the field of psychedelics research? What was the bridge between those things, or was it always present for you in the sense that this was always something that you were aware of from the, like even from your bachelor studies all the way through, or was it something that you discovered later on and then saw the parallels that were running between?
Yeah, so I think I had a long-term interest in psychedelics as a field of critical inquiry, even from a young age. I think, but of course, this was never a formal sort of education. However, I did recognize or realize that psychedelic culture was very strongly connected to contemporary spirituality and religiosity as well. And as an anthropologist or as a critical scholar of these sort of cultures, of course, I had a sort of amateur interest in that, which changed in 2016 when I was in Amsterdam. I was doing my PhD research, and there was this international conference for psychedelic research organized by the Open Foundation in Amsterdam in 2016, where I was as a participant. And when I was there, I basically realized there was great research being done, amazing results, stuff like that, parts which I knew about and parts which I really didn't know. This was really the early days of the revolution, so to say. But I also realized that though a lot of the research was sound, there were some big hermeneutical gaps about what we were doing here. So the philosophical questions were very much either left to the side, which I think is fine, as a sort of agnosticism, or they were very much based on 50s and 60s and 70s approaches towards psychedelics, which might be great in their own right, but I felt there was a gap going on there. And I also felt there were like basically two different cultures. You had like the sort of old hippie-ish enthusiasts, and then you had like the clinical scientists. And these were also like two completely disconnected worlds who could only be there together because that was the only way to bridge a sort of conference. And for the philosophers who were there, I also felt they went maybe discussing Wittgenstein or stuff like that, but I didn't feel that they had a hands-on approach, maybe even anthropologically, what was happening there. So basically, I wrote down a few notes for myself at that conference as an audience member, and I submitted that to the Beyond Psychedelics conference in Prague a year later, where I was invited as a speaker. And that was basically where my sort of public moment as a psychedelics interested researcher started.
What did you speak about at that conference? I'm curious.
Well, there I basically argued in favor of this sort of looking for new metaphysical patterns or ways of thinking to sort of bridge this gap maybe between the old hippie culture and the sort of new therapeutic psychedelic research that was developed there, which I then I called for a new materialism, which I basically kept going back to as saying, well, this is at least a direction which is interesting to look at, not as the solution, but more as a sort of starting point for anybody to to take serious the metaphysical questions or the political questions or the philosophical questions that are also the philosophical presuppositions that nobody maybe speaks about when we do psychedelic research, and this specific heritage or this specific history from which psychedelic research emerges.
Do you feel like that's still, I don't want to say your quest, but is this still something that you're working heavily on nowadays, or have your goals or have your focuses, have they changed quite a bit? This was what, in 2017, the Beyond Experience Conference? Do you feel like that you're still in a sense pushing down that trajectory, or has, since you've sort of, let's say, come deeper into the field, have your motivations changed a lot? Your personal ones, I mean.
I'm not sure if this is an answer to your question, but what at least changed in my perspective also from the analysis of the field is what changed between 2016 and 2021, I think, is money. So there's a lot more money in the field. And in 2016, there was no money. And now everything is on the background behind money, behind funding, who funds what's going on. And I think also that the hippies lost, in a sense, and that the therapeutic clinical cultures and trials are going really good and really well, really positive, and there's great results, and there's a lot of understanding from the broader audience and from politicians. But there's also pouring a lot of capital in. So where maybe 4 years ago my interest was more philosophical, it's now becoming more politico-philosophical. Like, what are the larger societal forces pushing here? How is capital coming in? How is capitalism coming in? And how does that transform the psychedelic experience? Or how does that transform psychedelic culture? So that's maybe a shift in my interest.
That's a perfect answer to the question. Do you feel that, I mean, we've come a long way. You mentioned just even in the last 4 years with the money, which I think that there's good and bad sides to money becoming a bigger player in the game. And I want to ask you a bit about that when we start to look forward in time. But I'm curious, it's something I think about a lot. What do you feel is still one of the biggest, let's say you could say, stumbling blocks or misconceptions that you personally see a lot in maybe your work, or for example, on the maybe in the philosophy or ethics side of things? Where do you feel we haven't made as much progress as we could, or where you feel like a lot of people are still looking at things perhaps in the wrong light, despite all of the progress we have made? Is there anything that sort of stands out as an area that people are still misunderstanding when it comes to psychedelics or psychedelics research or their possible benefits? Or
well, I think there's two things that I would like to address as hermeneutical topics, and one of them is, I think, the mind. I think that the mind is a concept, a philosophical concept, which has been following psychedelics since, I mean, it's in the word psyche, but which strongly puts psychedelics in this Cartesian framework. So for me, I'm a materialist. For me, psychedelics are material. So what I think is a very interesting direction is the old setting substance, because those look at material and context conditions. However, very often psychedelics are still being conceptualized in these terms of experience or mental phenomena. That's not to deny that, but I think we should look at psychedelic experiences as events, as meetings, as interspecies meetings between me, but that's a body, and that body is also already a multiplicity, so there's no Kantian I. And in a sense, psychedelics is always been understood as this warped ego, this insight where you go inside and then you go in a sort of deep my journey, in a sense. And of course you can go to questions of ego loss, etc., etc. Okay, so then you have the more materialistic approach. We're going to look at the neurosciences, we're going to look at the chemicals, etc., etc. I think that's all perfectly legitimate, because I'm a materialist too. However, what we're losing is that you have like sort of two sort of cultures, either the sort of hard reductionalist materialism, and on the other hand, you have the Cartesian dualism, where you say we have mind and then we go into this psychedelic experience. So for me, I would like to give the richness of experience, which is a material condition, which is me together with the plant or the substance in a room with other people, with other plants, with other animals, with music, which are sort of sound waves, etc., as more of an encounter, where it's also not clear who does what and who initiates what, and I think that is sort of the main misconception, because now you get the sort of hard reductionistic materialist science who says, well, this is how it works on the brain level. Oh, great, I love you guys, great in explaining. And then you have the sort of philosophical gap, like how does mind emerge from this? But I think that's the wrong question, because the reality is always already there, and it's neither material nor mental. It is an event. It's sort of event together. But and for me, that would be.
Could I interject real quick with a quick question on that? When you say it's an event, is this a? Do you mean that in sort of a more like an eliminative materialist perspective, and kind of like, I don't know if you know, like how Churchland might have mentioned it, or like how Daniel Dennett might have mentioned it, sort of like in the famous sort of quainting qualia, where he's sort of saying this internal experience is actually not what we think it is, or is not there at all. It might have been misunderstanding. When you say, could you explain what you mean a bit more by
I would
it's an
say,
event and maybe not an experience, or not a personal thing, but an event, an interspecies event?
Yeah. I would say, I mean, I'm not sure if I don't think I fundamentally disagree with Churchland or Dennett. On the other hand, I'm also not sure whether I'm really aligned with them.
Okay.
My position would more be, if there are mental events, if there is like a sort of mental realm, it doesn't matter much. So maybe I'm not a hard reductionist in the Churchland sense of the term, because that would still be a position on, okay, it's the same as whether the question, does God exist? I would say, well, it's an irrelevant question. So I put the question aside. Does consciousness exist? For me, it's also an irrelevant question. I put the question aside. Some would say that makes me a hard reductionist, but that would be, I don't believe that the mind exists, which is not my position either. I'm more aligned with Nietzsche. Your big intelligence is your body, and your mind is your small intelligence. So when we look at psychedelics and we see this as a sort of opposition between mind and body, which are sort of equal in size, the Cartesian way, then we miss the huge material, present, event-like quality of what psychedelics are and are about.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. I wish I could actually drill into that a bit more. It's really fascinating, but for the sake of time, would you mind if I ask you a bit? So how do you see, maybe specifically here in this, let's say, subfield of psychedelics research, or psychedelic science would maybe be a better term. How do you see that changing moving forward? I know you already mentioned a little bit about where we've come from in the last 4 or 5 years, but how about moving forward? Do you see progress in this area? Or you could even comment more on just, let's say, the realm of psychedelics research and therapy and science at large.
Yeah.
I'm curious what comes to mind looking forward for you.
Yeah, so if you ask me like psychedelic science, or I would say I would call it psychedelic studies, because that for me catches it in the broadest terms. I like that, psychedelic studies. Of course, what we haven't addressed here is the therapy aspect, because that is where the successes are being made. That's also where the money is coming in. And of course, I'm not a clinician, but the explanation I give to you now is sort of this sort of more of metaphysical sort of position. But what is happening now in the psychedelic fields with great success is these therapeutical advancements, these phase 3 trials, these professorships, that sort of stuff. But poses us a completely different question. And that's actually not a question of the mind. I'm currently working on a research project on what we call the medical humanities. Mm-hmm. So the way how sort of humanities thinking is influencing or converging with medical science. And there's an issue here going on, because if you say psychedelics are a promising tool for therapy, then you make a claim about health. And that is, I think, the philosophical question here, which is not necessarily addressed, which doesn't only go for psychedelic studies, but for any sort of medical science. The question, what is it? What does it mean to be a healthy human being? And also there we see that this question remains very strongly embedded in a philosophical religious heritage about what health is. You get questions of euthanasia, and we also have questions of end of life. So how can psychedelics help us and stuff like that? And there I see that this question of what is health and what does it mean to be a flourishing human being, or be a flourishing being, or be flourishing on this earth, is also a little bit maybe just not addressed enough. So because of a enthusiasm for the psychedelics therapy. So let's say I'm an enthusiast of psychedelics therapy too, right? I am, I think, and I'm also an enthusiast about the possibilities of psychedelics research toward therapy. However, this optimism can also blind us if we just go with certain conceptions of health and well-being without addressing the fundamental questions about what health actually is, and why we would need to want to be healthy or mentally healthy. Also, again, and then you get into capitalism critique, like what are the origins of our mental, if there is a sort of societal mental illness, you could say, what are the causes of that? How is that related to our productive aspirations, things we feel that we need to do in life, etc. And why do psychedelics then emerge as a panacea? And that's my final moment. Like I'm very hopeful of this psychedelic therapy research, but we lose something as well, and that is to see the value of psychedelics in its own right, not as a cure, but just as a valuable event, as an interesting event with maybe no purpose. And that's not the same as saying recreative use of drugs, right? That's the old dichotomy, like you have recreative or therapeutic. Whereas you can also say, well, this meeting with me with the plant is just valuable or not valuable because it's fucking me up in its own right. And I like that the psychedelic research towards therapy has made psychedelic research so-called salon faire. But on the other hand, I'm also a bit skeptical of what we might lose and in whose interest this therapy will go.
I completely agree with that. I think just from my experience, which is mostly with mind, there is a sense though, and this is to shine a positive light on what you just said. I think a lot of people in the field or in these studies understand that this is a way that we may have to approach these things right now, to start with therapy, not because we want to end there, not because we think that psychedelics are only useful as therapeutic tools, but only because of the way that the state of affairs right now inside of, let's say, Western culture, to take a different approach, as we know from what happened in the 60s and the 70s, is just not feasible. And it would not be clever. So in a sense, to be able to have the freedom to explore the use of psychedelics in other avenues or in other ways, we need to first found or ground them in what culture is willing to even take a look at. If that at least that's something that I think about.
Sure.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, I've taken so much of your time, and I know this room has been booked for another meeting.
Oh wow.
Run over. So I just want to ask you real quick. Is there anything about this conference that, other than coming to Berlin for the amazing food and because you have friends here, is there anything in particular that you've been looking forward to or that stood out to you perhaps with some of the other speakers or the topics?
Well, I think I really like that this stuff is coming together, and the platform that Mind and Insight seems to be offering, that's already valuable and necessary. And yeah, I see I'm looking behind you, and I see from science to implementation. And yeah, I certainly sort of agree with the fact that, the legitimacy is there now, and then the question is what it means to implement that. So I agree with that sort of trajectory. Yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing that and seeing how we can move that forward.
Very cool. Well, we are very, very, very much looking forward to having you with us.
Yeah, great.
Cool.
Thank you, Bradley.